We're going to get into our guest speaker, and what we're going to do, John Pelster from De La Salle High School is going to be the guest speaker this morning, and he's going to talk to the campers. And after he's done with his talk, he'll probably speak for roughly 40 minutes on his talk. And if he goes a little bit longer, that's great. That means he has a lot of good things to say to people. But we're going to do a question and answer session with that. So if during John's talk, if you guys got questions, throw them out there, and then at the end of his talk, we'll go through the questions, and we'll try to get some of those questions that were asked today. So, Chuck, any more introductions for John, or we just let John go? All right, John.
I think we're ready to go with John.
All right, John Pelster, it's all yours. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I hope you all can hear me. I can see me now, so that's maybe a good sign. I want to tell Chuck, first of all, that he is mistaken about one thing that he just said, that Berkeley is far from the preeminent public institution in the world. Anyone who knows anything would attest to the fact that it is UC Santa Babylon or Santa Barbara. Just go there and compare it to Berkeley, and I think you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So anyway, without further ado, I'll go ahead and get into my presentation in just a second here. I do want to compliment Chuck on the presentation that he did last night. I found it really quite powerful and moving. Anybody who knows anything about De La Salle High School will know that we do have quite a few things in common with Camp Olindo, and so that a lot of what you said, Chuck, last night did speak to my experiences at De La Salle High School. So that was great stuff. And now we're going to get, if I can, all right, so we are now going to present what's called Running is Mental. Okay, so Running is Mental, that's my presentation for today. We're going to start with a little introduction, personal introduction to myself. Then we're going to get into some general concepts that I keep in mind when I'm thinking about training, and general concepts about the mental side of running. And we'll start from the obvious and work towards stuff that is less obvious. We'll go into ideas about workout mentality and mental approaches to your workouts, and then we'll follow that up with approaches to racing. We'll talk, if we have time, we'll get to a kind of a success story that I can tell you, and then we'll follow that up with some final words and Q&A. So that's kind of where we're headed right now. All right. Personal introduction. What we've got here is, first of all, I'm a De La Salle High School grad, and I was also a graduate of the Humboldt State Running Camp. I don't know if Kevin was there when I was there, but I attended camp in 1986, and I remember very well being awakened in the morning by, I don't know if it was Tuttle or Scobie going through the halls shouting cock-a-doodle-doo at the top of his lungs. But that was, I do remember that vividly from my time at camp. I am married. I've got 3 kids. 2 of whom actually did go to College Park High School. So we have the Falcon connection going on. Just because everybody enjoys seeing a picture of me with hair for some reason, I included a picture of me running on the De La Salle track there in 1994, back when it was still a dirt track and I still had hair. There's a picture of the newest addition to the Pelster family, the kitten right there, and his name is Phineas. And then I am a Golden State Warriors fan, and I am not one of these bandwagon fans. I can tell you who was on the team in 1981 when I started following them. If any of you have ever heard of Joe Barry Carroll, he was the center and also went by the nickname Joe Barely Cares. So that's a little bit about me. Then let's see what we have next in terms of coaching. So we'll get into some coaching background here, and I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can. De La Salle High School is an all-boys Catholic school. It is in the East Bay, in the Bay Area. It's about 1,000 students, a little over 1,000 students. We compete in Division II in California. In the time that I've been coaching, we've won 16 NCS titles. We've won the NCS championship 8 times with individuals. 3 of the athletes I've coached have gone on to the Foot Locker Nationals. In 2015, I was the NorCal Coach of the Year for the California Coaches Association. And one of the things that I'm most proud of, to be honest, is the fact that over the last 10 to 15 years, over 80% of the time that De La Salle runners have a chance to improve on a course, they improve. So 4 out of 5 times that an athlete is running on a course that they've competed on previously, they run faster. And that's something that I'm actually just as proud of pretty much as all of the other things that are on that slide. They don't necessarily get the accolades, but it really is something that the program is really geared toward improvement. And I'm proud of the fact that so many of our runners improve. So I'll start the mental side of running by looking at this graph, which is something called the Yerkes-Dodson law from 1908. And what this is showing you is that even over 100 years ago, there was already a sense that there's a connection between performance and your mental state. And some of you may have seen this graph before, some of you may not. But what this is showing you is that if your interest and the idea of arousal at the bottom, you might think of it as anxiety, you might think of it as care. Arousal is kind of a strange word to us today, I think, because it's usually associated with other things besides sports. But you can call it anxiety or interest or whatever you have, but it's essentially your mental state. And if you have a low level of interest in what you're doing, you're not likely to have a good performance. Likewise, if you are especially anxious, so if you're over at the far right-hand side of the graph, you're also not likely to have a good performance. You really need to have some kind of a state of mind that is aroused, that is fired up, but not overly anxious and not under interested, if that makes sense. Now, to give you a maybe a more concrete example, I'll switch to the next slide. And whoops, went one too far. So if, I don't know at your school, and I don't mean to denigrate the lacrosse players at De La Salle High School, but we refer to them as lax bros. And if you've ever had some of these guys on the team, you may know that their level of interest tends to be somewhat lower than maybe your dedicated cross-country athlete. And as a result, their performances tend to be somewhat less inspired, shall we say. They tend not to care, and they tend not to do especially well as a result. At the other end of the spectrum, I'm going to tell you about what kind of runner I was in high school. If you read the biography that I submitted to the camp, it'll say that I was a mediocre runner, and that's absolutely positively true. And part of the reason why I was a mediocre runner was that I was what you would call a head case. I was a classic head case in high school. I started out running because I got cut from my basketball team my sophomore year. So junior year, I had a buddy who was on the team, and he suggested that I give it a try. So I ran cross country in my junior year and enjoyed it. Went out for track my senior year, and the first time I stepped on the track was at Pittsburgh High School. I remember it very clearly. I just was out there to have fun. Got in the race, kind of ran with the pack for 3 laps, and then the last lap I took off and I won my first race on the track. I ran a 4:47, which is, not earth-shattering, but it's a decent time for your first time running a race. And then I had fun. But after that, it became more and more pressure-filled, and the coach, I was our fastest miler, and so our coach was constantly putting me in the mile and expecting me to perform, and as a coach naturally would. The problem is that I struggled with that pressure, and I ended up getting more and more and more anxious and tense before races, and my performances tended to get worse and worse and worse. And I would spend the whole day dreading the race, and it kind of overwhelmed my whole life. And so that's why JP is over on the bottom right-hand side of that graph, because that's where I was. I was overly anxious, and I did not perform as well as I think I could have, given my physical talent, because of my mental anxiety, because I was such a head case. So you want to be somewhere up at the top of the graph, which is why I put YOU right up there. So that's just kind of a sense of how running mentality can affect performance. So now we're going to go ahead and get into some of the general concepts about running and running mentality. And I hope you all enjoy this picture. I chose it because running is hard. And if there's one thing that you don't get from the picture on the right, it is that running is hard. But the fact of the matter is, running is hard, right? If you think about how many people, when you tell a person that you're a runner, right, they look at you as if you're maybe slightly deranged. And that's kind of the pun that's built into the title, Running is Mental, because a lot of people who find out that you're a runner probably think you are a little bit mental, and maybe we are. But the point is that running is hard. And a lot of people quit running. A lot of people never start running because of the fact that it's just hard. Peter Brewer, famous North Coast section coach Peter Brewer, had a shirt that basically testified that running, of course it's hard, I think was what the shirt said. And then the other thing is that's important to realize is that, and this is actually important, is that running is hard. All sports are hard. Golf is hard. Baseball is hard. Football is hard, but they're hard in different ways than endurance sports are hard. Sure, it's hard to shoot free throws at a pressure pack point in the game. Sure, it's hard to hit a chip shot out of a sand trap. Sure, it's hard to hit a 90-mile-an-hour fastball, but it's not the same as the kind of hard that you're going to find in the last mile of a 5K. It's not the same. Getting hit by a linebacker is hard, but it's not the same as pushing yourself through mile intervals, say. There's a difference that I like to talk about with pain and suffering. And so, whoops, I keep clicking too far. Now I really got to go back. Sorry. All right. There's a Buddhist proverb that says that pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. I'm not going to claim to be a psychologist, and I'm not going to try to explain all of the nuances of that statement. But the idea for me is that football can be painful, but it's not suffering. Running to me is akin to suffering, because it is something that it's kind of pain drawn out over a long period of time. And so running successfully requires suffering. And that's true whether you are at the front of the race, the middle of the race, or the back of the race. If you want to be a successful runner, you have to be able to embrace suffering. And so if you don't, and you don't have to, right? Because suffering is optional. You don't have to suffer, but if you choose to suffer, then you have to be able to embrace it. And that's part of the mental approach to running that I think you have to have. You can't be in denial about the fact that running is hard. So that's kind of that's really the first most obvious general concept that I wanted to discuss. Now, another general concept is the idea that positive energy is contagious. Okay, this may be something that you're familiar with. You may have read about this or seen something to that effect, but positive energy is contagious. And I think with that fact in mind, and you may say, well, what does it have to do with running? Well, I'm going to explain. You have to make environmental choices. And what I'm talking about here is, who are you going to choose to be in your environment? Are you going to choose to be around people who give off positive energy? Are you going to be the kind of person who gives off positive energy? In order to be a successful runner, I believe that you have to make constructive environmental choices. You have to put yourself in an environment that is positive, that is constructive. And because of that, I think you'll be more successful. So to put it another way, there are two types of people, at least in this world, but this is one way to categorize people. Some people are sails and some people are anchors, right? Some people will drive the boat forward and some people hold the boat back. You have a choice in your life to be a sail or an anchor. And I do believe that this is something that is a choice. And those people who choose to be sails ultimately are going to be more successful in this thing we call running and in this thing we call life than people who choose to be anchors. So that's another important general concept with running. The more positive energy you can surround yourself with, I think the more successful you're going to be. You don't want to be a whiner. You don't want to be a complainer. In some ways, it's better to be silent, if you will, than to be negative. So we're all plagued by doubts and fears. Everyone is. The most successful runners I've had have had anxiety, have had doubts, have had fears, have been nervous, all those sorts of things. But those things didn't get verbalized. It's better, like I said, to be silent than negative. You may have someone on your team. You may have more than one person on your team who is a person who, the day of a hard workout, they're grumbling, they're complaining, they're whining, and it brings everybody down. So don't be that person. And you will be more successful for not being that person. If you have those ideas, redirect your attention. Think about something else to the extent that you can. Okay? So I think this little video, I think, is going to be one that you'll find interesting. If you look at the knuckles on this individual, this, by the way, is another little known fact, is that I did study karate for a while. Let's watch this video, see if this comes across. I hope you can see this. There's no sound you need. But you can see what this guy is doing. He's hitting a board wrapped in rope. And the reason why he's doing that is to strengthen the knuckles on his hands, strengthen the bones in his hands, and to toughen them up for the sake of combat. So I hope you all were able to see that, because that is called callousing, right? Those big, these things right here on his knuckles, those are calluses. And callousing, in my opinion, is a very, very beneficial thing. And that's not to be confused with callousing, callousing. And I can explain that later perhaps, but that's more of a mental state. To be callous is to be unfeeling in a personal way. And we don't want to be callous like that. We want to be kind. If you remember Chuck's presentation from last night. But this kind of callousing is different, right? Whoops, didn't mean that. You can watch him again. But toughness is something that is learned, right? If you think about infants, if you think about babies, babies are not tough, right? There's a common expression in the culture, don't be such a baby, right? Babies are not known for their toughness, and that's something that we want to embrace. We need to be tough to be runners. And tough is not just a physical thing. Tough is very much a mental thing. And so when you think about workouts and you think about practices, you have to try to work on your mental toughness. You have to realize that workouts do have a mental component, and that practicing toughness and going through those difficult situations is something ultimately that will be beneficial to you. I believe that the most successful runners have an attitude where they're willing to embrace inconvenience. And this goes, actually, I believe, above and beyond practice. Okay, so what am I talking about now? I'm talking about air conditioning, and I'm talking about heated car seats and heated steering wheels. Air conditioning is something that I think has, I actually think this has weakened us as a nation. I think heated car seats and heated steering wheels have undermined our toughness as a nation. And so when I'm talking about inconvenience, of course, this is a little bit lighthearted, but I do think there's something to it. I think people who take the stairs as a matter of practice are stronger than people who take elevators, if that makes sense. Embracing those little inconveniences translates to a whole perspective as an individual that I think can be productive when it comes to athletic competition. If you're the kind of person who will walk up the stairs instead of taking an elevator, if you're the kind of person who is willing to deal with the hot weather and just roll your windows down, say, instead of running air conditioning because you're trying to toughen yourself up, I think that's a great attitude to have to be a successful endurance athlete. So I know some of you are probably thinking it's ludicrous, but I think it's true. All right. Another general concept, and this is one that maybe, again, we're moving toward the less obvious concepts here, but exercise fatigue. So where it says psychological fatigue limits, what I'm talking about here is that exercise fatigue is actually very much a mental phenomenon. Okay. That's not our experience of it in the middle of a race or at the end of the race. We don't think, boy, I'm really mentally tired right now. But as a matter of fact, what causes people to feel exhausted is largely mental. The scientists have done a number of experiments about this sort of thing, where they have athletes exercise to the point of exhaustion, to where the athlete considers himself or herself to be physically completely depleted, 100% exhausted. If they hook those athletes up to electrodes to see if their muscles will still contract, guess what happens? Their muscles contract. The reason why is that they actually have not hit a complete physical limit. What they've actually done is essentially found out what we call the central governor theory. So the central governor theory is that your brain likes to keep the body in a state of homeostasis, and you've probably all learned that in science class at some point in your life. But the brain tries to keep the body in a state of equilibrium, and extreme exercise is not a state of equilibrium, right? And so what happens is, in order to protect the body from getting overheated, from getting damaged, essentially what the brain does is it tells itself, you're tired, and you will slow down in order for your brain to sort of self-protect. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a physical limit, and it's not to say that there aren't people who will get to a state of absolute physical limit. I've seen it myself in my coaching experience that there are some athletes who will disregard what the brain is telling them and actually go to a point of actual danger, which is kind of what your brain is trying to get you to avoid by instituting the sort of central governor practice. But the brain has self-preservation kind of built into it, and when you feel exhausted, when you're at the end of the race and you feel like you're going as hard as you can go, there's something to the idea that you're really not. And there are ways to kind of rewire yourself to be able to push a little harder and to be able to go a little farther and a little harder than you were before. So that's kind of what we're getting at here with this idea of, oh boy, I should be a little better at this, shouldn't I? All right, here we go. But the other thing I want to get to is the last thing on this general concept about mental fatigue is the idea that there are different types of mental fatigue. And another thing that psychologists have found is that if they give people difficult mental tasks before testing them physically, so if they have athletes take a difficult math or science test, say, for example, before going out and trying to test their PR for a mile, they will find that athletes who are mentally tired will run slower than the same athlete when they are mentally fresh. So what does this mean? This means that if you take the SAT in the morning and you go race in the afternoon, you're actually at a physical disadvantage compared to an athlete who is mentally well rested. So there's a lot of research that shows that your mental state affects your physical performance. Okay, and that's what I'm trying to kind of, to the general concept here that it's good to keep in mind when you're looking at your athletic performance. All right, now we're going to go to my next slide. I am just battling these slides right now. Okay, so another idea here, this is the idea of burning matches. So when I went to college, I got into cycling, and I raced bicycles for 4 years in college and a little bit after that. And in the cycling world, they talk about burning matches. And so in a race, and cycling races tend to be a little different than running races. So, cycling races tend to be multiple hour efforts, and you have, because it's such a long extended effort, you can attack and you can rest, and you can attack and you can rest. And the idea is that you can only attack so many times in a race because there are only so many matches in your match book. And eventually, if you keep attacking, if you keep burning your matches, you're going to be all out. I want to point out that I think that there are so there's a mental component to this analogy as well. And the idea is that there is this phenomenon known as burnout, right? And I think burnout is largely a mental or an emotional sort of state. So at the end of the season, the reality is, if you've been trained well, if you have a good coach, at the end of the season, generally, you're not physically worn out. But at the end of the season, you may very well be mentally worn out. All of the stress and all of the strain of all of the races take a toll on you. And by the end of the season, you may just be mentally ready for a break. You've burnt all your mental matches, if you will. Your physical matches are fine. You've recovered physically, but mentally, you're just kind of cooked. And so it's important as you go through a season, it's important as you go through a year, that you don't burn all your matches mentally. Now, that has physical connections as well. And so the next bullet point there I have is that overdrive is counterproductive. So occasionally, and this may apply to you, it may not apply to you, but there are athletes out there who are what I would call overdriven. I've had athletes in the past who believed that they had to go hard all the time. And mentally, that was just who they were. That was kind of their psychological framework, was that if I'm not going hard, it's not doing any good at all. And so that can be a very counterproductive sort of mental state. Because again, we all have drive, we all have ambition. Some people have overdrive. And if you are one of those overdriven individuals, you have to be very careful, because that is where you can lead yourself into a state of overtraining, or maybe better stated is under recovery. Because typically, physical improvement is a combination of hard work and recovery, and these overdriven individuals tend not to let themselves recover. And so that's something that you have to keep in mind. And so that mental approach is something that is an important concept that you have to be aware of. Okay. So last general concept I want to talk about is this idea, I call it the locus of focus. And I like that just because it rhymes and it's kind of a little play on words, but locus is just a fancy word for a point. And what I want you to be aware of is the fact that there are different focus points during athletic competition or during athletic performance. You can have an external focus, or you can have an internal focus. So what do I mean by that? So an external focus would be while you're running, while you're racing, that you're focusing on, your mind is attuned to and paying attention to things like the course, the terrain, the teammates around you, the competitors around you, the clock, the distance. All those sorts of things are outside of you. Those are external focus points. And during a race or during a run, during a workout, those are things that you can pay attention to. On the other hand, there is also internal focus points. And these things would be how your legs feel, how your lungs feel, what your heart rate is, how hard you're breathing, just whatever physical sensations or emotional sensations that you may be having. So while you're running, you can have a focus on the inside, or you can have a focus on the outside. And the reality is that both of them are necessary, and both of them have a purpose. But the other thing that is about them is that they will tend to focus, or excuse me, they'll tend to shift during a workout or during a race. And I'll talk a little more about that later on. But as a general concept, I want you to keep in mind that you can have external focuses or internal focuses while you're running and while you're racing. All right. Now we're going to get to talking about some workout mindsets, workout mentality. And there are 3 different types of workouts that I want to offer to you and give you some thoughts about different mental approaches to these things. Long runs, medium runs, recovery runs. These tend to be lower intensity efforts. These are days where you want to relax. These are days where, in my opinion, as a coach, that you do not want to burn your matches. You should be focused on being as efficient as possible on these kinds of days. I would also recommend that you try to enjoy these days, really, because these shouldn't be real hard days. I know for some people, if you're a 400, 800 runner and you're running cross country as preseason conditioning for track, long runs may be kind of dreadful to you. You need to try to find a way to enjoy them. What I try to tell my runners is that you should try to find some kind of joy on those runs. You need to try to find something on those runs that gives you energy. And I try to do this, I don't do a heck of a lot of running now because, well, let's just say I'm old, but I'm not as old as some people, but I am a little older than Chuck is. So he's trying to catch up, but he's not gonna. But I think it's important when I go out and I'm training and I try to go on a long runs, I'm always trying to find something that makes me smile, something that makes me happy on those runs. And that leads me to the next point, which is to smile. There have actually been psychological studies and physiological studies on athletes, and they were testing to see whether or not facial expressions had an influence or an impact on their athletic performance. And what they found was that smiling while running increased running economy by up to 2.8%. So smiling while running will increase your running economy by up to 2.8%. And that's pretty substantial. That's no joke. I don't think you can smile the whole time while you're running, but try it the next time you're out on a long run. Try giving yourself for 10 seconds or 15 seconds a genuine, honest smile. I do this myself when I'm out running, and I swear to you that I feel better after I do it. It's a strange phenomenon, and I can't tell you exactly why it works, and I don't know that the researchers can tell you exactly why it works, but I'll be darned, I feel better when I'm smiling. It becomes kind of contagious. It comes back to that second, general concept that positive energy is contagious and a smile is positive. And sure enough, it somehow, some way provides energy. So on those long runs, I would really encourage you to, number one, don't burn any matches, be efficient, and then smile. Find some joy in what you're doing. On the other end of the spectrum, in terms of workout mentality, is just a general umbrella of intervals. These things are your most similar efforts to racing, right? This is kind of a dress rehearsal where you are trying to prep yourself mentally as well as physically to perform in races. The things that I would suggest for you to keep in mind for the mental approach to intervals, and this is certainly something I did not do when I was a high school athlete. You remember I was such a head case. Well, this is what I did not do. And if I had done this, I believe I would have been much more successful. I'd begin with a certain amount of emotional detachment. I suspect there are some of you out there that on a day that is going to be a hard workout where you have long intervals or hill work or something like that, that you kind of dread that. It's going to be painful and you don't like it. And a certain amount of anxiety builds up. My advice to you is to try to detach emotionally from those sorts of things. Try not to be preoccupied with those efforts. Keep things in perspective. And you'll actually lower your anxiety level and increase your performance. So Something else that is useful is, and this is something I took from Matt Fitzgerald's book, How Bad Do You Want It, is this term bracing. And if you think about, if somebody says brace yourself, what do? Well, you get ready for something that's about to happen. And bracing in terms of the mental approach to running is something that you're preparing yourself for what is about to happen. And how you do that is by remembering that, number one, it's hard, but also remembering that it's temporary. I think remembering that this is something you've done before and have survived and gotten through is something that will help you to be braced for what's about to happen. Thinking about previous workouts, thinking about workouts you've done that you've been successful, workouts that have made you a better runner, will help you to brace yourself for the difficulties of the interval workout that you have in front of you. They will bring you confidence. And confidence, again, is a very positive sort of mindset. And that confidence is something, again, that will be contagious. So I do believe that bracing is something that's really important. And the way you brace yourself, like I said, is by keeping things in perspective, by reminding yourself that you've done it before, and that there's nothing really at stake in the same way that in a race something is at stake. The other way that you might think about approaching intervals would be to consider them as experiments. If you're a person who is an inquisitive, kind of scientific sort of person, you might think about training intervals as experiments. You're going to try going out harder. You're going to try saving energy. You're going to try doing something different in the workouts that you think might transfer to more effective racing. I would absolutely suggest that you discuss that with your coaches before you decide you're going to go out hell-bent for leather on the first mile repeat, for example. But think of it as experimentation, and I think that's a way to keep the interval workouts new and fresh mentally. All right. The other kind of run in general that I would say, and some of you may know what this is, some of you may not, this is a metronome. Metronomes help keep rhythm or tempo to music, and that's why I have it on the slide with tempo runs. What I would say for this is that the tempo or threshold run, you're going to need to have some kind of a mental approach that is kind of a combination of your long run mentality and your interval mentality. And what I would also suggest is it probably is going to shift, that you're going to start from a more relaxed kind of long run mentality, and you're going to transfer into a more interval minded approach to the workout. So in terms of your mental approach to tempos and thresholds, that's what I would have you consider. All right. Now we get to racing. Now, in terms of racing, I would say that first and foremost, that your mental approach to racing is going to be dependent on the race itself. Are you a kind of person who is going to be in first place in this particular race? Are you racing for the win? Are you racing for the top 10? Or are you racing for the top 100? I think your mental approach for those races should be different in certain ways. I think, to be honest with you, I think it's always easier to race for a win than it is to race for 100th place. I was definitely one of the guys who would be in a cross-country race racing for 100th. And I do think from a psychological or mental standpoint that racing for a win would have been easier. Physically, it's not necessarily, but mentally, I think that idea of believing you're going to win is something that is a real advantage. The other thing is that it's going to depend on whether or not this is a preseason race or whether it's a postseason race or whether it's in the middle of the season somewhere. So those kinds of realities will make a difference on your race mentality. Now, the next thing I would say is that we talked a little earlier about external and internal focus. I think that you have to have a kind of a blend of these things while you're racing. And I think that the most effective races are, and this is, again, definitely my experience, is that they tend to be internal focus in the early stages of the race. And as the race goes on, as the race evolves, the focus tends to be more and more external. You start to spend more time and energy focusing on the people around you and who you have to pass and who you have to keep up with. So from a psychological or mental standpoint, I would have you consider doing that you want to start the race paying attention to your internal sensations, gauging your efforts, not going out too hard, not going out too easy, feeling your way through the beginning of the race as appropriate. But then in the last parts of the race, everybody's going to be hurting. Everyone's going to be going as hard as they can go. And the most successful racers are the ones who are able to have an external focus and really stop worrying about how they feel and start worrying about where they are. You don't want your races to be time trials. And so having that external focus is a real motivator, in my opinion, in my experience, during races. So in terms of bracing, this is also something that's very important for a racing mentality. Your pre-race routine will help you to brace yourself and be more successful because it's going to get your mind ready for the race at hand. If you think about the music that you might listen to before a race, lots of athletes listen to music before they race. And the kinds of music that they listen to is really something that is that's related to bracing. A lot of athletes prefer to have up-tempo, hardcore kind of intense music before races because it helps them to be psychologically ready for the challenge at hand. I have, however, known athletes who kind of tend to the other end of the spectrum, and they listen to more laid back or mellow music because it actually helps them to bring their anxiety or their tension levels down. So for me, for example, as an athlete, I probably would have been better off listening to music that was a little more dialed back than music that was more intense, because I was already wound up, as tight as a guitar string anyway. So it would have been better listening to something to make me more intense. So those or hinder your performance from a purely mental standpoint. The next thing I would say is that if you look at visualization is something that you could write a whole book or do a whole presentation on, and I don't want to go into that too long, but I want you to kind of be aware of to successfully visualize. It's important to try to visualize every facet of the race that you can, from the temperature to the competition, everything that you can possibly do to visualize, do it. The more complete and the more thorough your visualization, the more effective it's going to be. That's as quick as I can give a presentation on visualization. But I would also say this, that sometimes visualization includes just, I'll get to when we get to the visual mantra. I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Mantras, I'm trying to get through this as quick as I can. I've been on about 40 minutes now. So mantras are short, positive, energized sorts of statements that you tell yourself during a race to keep yourself in a positive mindset, because it's very typical for people to, as the race starts to get more intense and you start to suffer more during a race, you need to try to redirect your thoughts to a more positive sort of place. And mantras are a great way to do that. And the mantra can be anything from go for it, you can do this, anything like that. It can be cheesy, it can be original. It's going to be something that is meaningful to you. I had a friend who, when he was in youth running, used to, this is kind of a visual mantra maybe as well as a verbal mantra, but he used to say monster in his head because he would pretend a monster was chasing him. And as goofy as that is, it helped him to run faster. So that sort of mantra idea is something that is absolutely worth trying. A visual mantra is, again, something that it can be something that is simple as a scene in your head that will help you to focus and redirect toward positive psychological state. It could be something as simple as a color. You could imagine and visualize your favorite color in the middle of a race to try to calm your nerves and refocus your attention. something just as simple as that can be all that it takes to get yourself back into a more positive frame of mind and to help yourself to perform more successfully. Ultimately, as I said here, what works for you is going to work for you, and you have to try. This is where, you know, trying these things in hard workouts is a great idea, because it's what works for you doesn't necessarily work for someone else, and you have to try to find what really works for you. But those are a variety of things in terms of racing mentality that I hope you might find useful. Okay. Success story. I'm going to go through this really quick. So this is a map of the region of the greatest university in the world, UC Santa Barbara. And that arrow right there is pointing to a spot on Highway 101, where in 1989, might have been 1990 actually, that year, that we were having a team time trial practice with the cycling team. And there's a gradual hill after El Capitan State Beach. And we were in a pace line, and the guy in front of me, I was second in line in this pace line, and the guy in front of me was the #1 rider on the team. And he was a guy who had actually won the national championship. He was going to win the national collegiate championship later that season. And I was on his wheel. And as we were going up this hill, he started to really increase the pace. And at that point in time, I decided that I was just going to stay on his wheel no matter what happened. And my focus was, I completely disregarded my internal focus and went to a completely external focus. And I just looked at his chain going around the cogs on his back wheel. And I said, I am not going to lose that wheel no matter what happens. I'll have to fall off my bike before I'm going to let this guy go. And we got to the top of the hill, and the rider in front of me, the #1 guy on the team, Trevor, pulled off, and I pulled through, and I was absolutely just about cross-eyed. I was completely at my limit, but I pulled through, and I tried to pull on the front of the pace line for a few seconds, and then I pulled off and looked over my shoulder, and Trevor and I were the only ones left. We had dropped everybody else. And so this was a success story, because for me, the head case, this was where I really figured out what it took to be successful as an athlete, that focus has to be external. Because I had been a person who was completely internally focused up until that point. And when I realized the idea of the external focus, it kind of flipped a switch for me. That year in 1990, we ended up, and this is me right on the front of the pace line, and this is me right over here, second in line, as we were about to win our national championship, national collegiate championship in the team time trial. And that comes down to, like I said, a change in my mental approach. And what I'm hoping is that for you, a change in your mental approach, or just a tinkering with something in your mental approach, might make you be a more successful athlete, whether you are in the front of the pack, the middle of the pack, the back of the pack, wherever you are, because running, of course, is mental. Final words. I'm an English teacher as well, so I'm going to leave you with this thought as your final words, that correct punctuation is actually pretty important. So please pay attention to where you put your commas, all right?
Xander Simone asks, when you're having a bad day or you're not doing so hot on a run, how do you lift yourself up? He actually says he likes to just smile, because I know I have a big smile and that lifts me up every time. You mentioned that. Anything else?
I think, you know, like I said, finding some kind of joy, thinking of something when you're on a run like that. I think, and it kind of depends if the run starts out good and then it goes bad, or if you're just having a bad day. But I do think on those kinds of runs that finding some kind of happiness while you're running, and it could be anything. You know, when I'm out for a run, I'll look for things like, you know, the fog coming over the hills in the west. I might look at the sunset. I might look at the sunrise. I might look at near where I live, there's a canal trail, and there's an otter in the canal the other day, and that was just something that was the best, right? Just find an otter in a canal, and that made my run great. So you have to, I think, consciously look for those positive things. That would be my answer, is that, smiling is a great thing, and I do think it helps, but looking for those positives consciously is a good way to lift yourself up. Okay. Again, speaking for myself, when bad things are going on, when you're bad frame of mind, your workout's not going well, your tendency is to go negative. I think you have to consciously choose to go positive.
Yeah, that's a great point. Rebecca Taylor asks, is there a mentally correct way to approach recovering from an injury?
Oh, Lordy. Patience. That's really hard. So I've had my fair share of injuries personally. I've coached a lot of athletes who have had a variety of injuries. Interesting that you mentioned that. So the year 1990, when we won the national collegiate championship in the team time trial, I actually couldn't ride my bike for 6 weeks that year because of Achilles tendonitis. And that was one of the most frustrating things that I'd ever endured as an athlete. And from a psychological, mental standpoint, I think you have to be patient, and I think you have to look for progress. Give yourself measuring points and look for those progress points, whatever it may be. And the other thing is, you have to look at them in terms of not hour to hour and not even day to day, but sometimes you have to back up and look at it from week to week, because progress is slow, but I found that it's inevitable. You will make progress. It's just, you have to be patient. And then when you have the progress in hand, really try to celebrate that and focus on it.
That's a great answer, John. I think too many young athletes, even older athletes, get very impatient. They want to get back on it, and rather than take a little bit of time when something's bugging you and rest it, well, we'll run through it. So yeah, you have to be very patient when injuries come along, for sure.
All right, we'll take one more question here. This is Charlotte Gilbert again. How can athletes tune out the many distractions that come with the territory? Homecoming is a big distraction most of the season.
Well, as a coach at an all-boys school, this is less of a concern for me, I have to tell you. I think that it's a matter of prioritization, and I think it's a matter of perspective. So this, again, is me looking at it as a coach, as a teacher, as a father. So I have 2 daughters, and they went through some of these things, and I think that I see these kind of things like homecoming and these distractions getting really blown out of proportion and magnified to a point where they aren't what they should be anymore. So these things get turned into like little mini weddings or something, and they really shouldn't be, right? This is a dance. This is a chance to get out and have fun. And to the extent that you can, I think it's good to just keep those things in perspective and remind yourself over and over, this is just a dance. This is just for fun. This is not, people want to tell you that, oh, this is the best time of your life and this and that and the other thing. And if your high school prom is the best time of your life, I think that there's a problem. I think there are many, many things beyond high school dances that you have to look forward to, bigger and better things. And I mean that in a positive way, really, that there's a lot of stuff after high school that will be more important than these proms. And you just have to kind of don't let people around you turn it into more than it really should be.
Yeah, my thought for the athletes, coaches, if you try to emphasize to the athletes that you're working with that, think of all the time. It's a track season. The proms are usually in the spring of the year. So track season starts on a normal year in February. So February, March, April, you have an athlete that puts 3 and 4 months worth of work into trying to accomplish something, and they can blow that up in one single night or one single weekend or one dance or whatever it is. So it's the athlete has to take all that in consideration. I do remember that I went to my senior dance, but it was the weekend of the North Coast section track and
Lost him.
I will say one other thing about that is that Jamie mentioned this last night in his presentation, but sleep is super important, and don't forget sleep. Sleep absolutely affects your mental state. I tell the athletes on my team that sleep is actually a performance enhancing drug, and it's 100% legal. So a lot of times I find that, just relating it to the last question, that when these proms and dances and things are going on, that's one of the things that gets sacrificed. And try not to sacrifice your sleep, because sleep is directly related to mood and attitude. And rested athletes have better mental attitudes and will have better performances as a result. Quick story. This goes back to the 90s, but we had an athlete who was qualified for Arcadia in the 2 mile, and Arcadia happened to fall that year at the end of our Easter break. And that athlete decided he was going to sleep at least 10 hours a night the entire week leading up to Arcadia Invitational. And he improved his PR in the 3200 by almost 20 seconds of that meet. And he, to this day, will attribute it directly to sleep. So